kind of warmth that should have promised comfort. Paisley was moving down the hallway toward the guest room when she noticed the study door left slightly open. Her father's voice carried through the crack, low but firm. "Your sister. She isn't worth a penny. She's done." For a second, Paisley thought she had misheard. Then Ethan's soft reply followed, uncertain, almost apologetic. Paisley stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. From her angle, she could just glimpse the curve of her mother's shoulder as she hovered by the window. William shuffled papers at his desk. Ethan sat slouched on the sofa, but it was Margaret who turned her head first. Her eyes met Paisley's across the narrow opening. Instead of shock or shame, she offered the smallest smile, as if she had been waiting for Paisley to hear. The smile hollowed Paisley out more than the words themselves. It told her everything she had feared but never wanted to believe, that her place in this family had been quietly revised, her value appraised and dismissed, all without her voice in the room. Paisley stepped back into the shadows, every memory of overlooked trophies and deferred praise colliding into one sharp truth. The house felt colder despite the fire burning in the hearth, each portrait on the wall reminding her whose face had always mattered more. By the time Paisley reached the guest room, her hands trembled so violently she could barely close the door. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bland floral comforter, the sounds of laughter from downstairs drifting upward as if nothing had broken. But something had, and Paisley knew she would not sleep that night. Sleep refused her, and instead her mind wandered backward through the years, tallying a ledger of childhood moments that now made terrible sense. Ethan was always the one under the lights when he made the debate finals his junior year. Her parents flew across the country without hesitation. That same week, Paisley had qualified for the state math championship. She went alone with her teacher, her parents sending her off with a polite smile and a reminder that Ethan needed their support more. "You'll be fine," her mother always said, her tone gentle but dismissive, as if independence had been Paisley's natural state, rather than a condition imposed by neglect. Paisley learned early that recognition was a resource allocated sparingly and rarely to her. There was one exception, her grandmother, Eleanor. She lived in a small craftsman bungalow across town, a house that smelled of chamomile and old books. On weekends, Eleanor would spread bank statements across her kitchen table and walk Paisley through the mysteries of compound interest and savings bonds. "Financial independence is freedom," she said more than once, her voice steady, her eyes sharper than anyone gave her credit for. While Ethan complained those visits were boring and often stayed home, Paisley absorbed every word. When Eleanor passed away during Paisley's senior year, she left her $15,000, specifically earmarked for education at the reading of the will. Paisley caught the quick glance her parents exchanged, something brittle in their expressions. Later, her mother remarked, almost casually, "Your grandmother always favored you, turning what had been a gift into a wedge." That inheritance became Paisley's ticket out, though even then it was reframed as imbalance. Ethan received tuition, housing, and endless allowances. Paisley stretched Eleanor's gift across scholarships and part-time jobs, learning to live within margins so tight they cut. Lying awake in the guest room now, Paisley realized Eleanor had done more than give her money. She had handed her tools her parents never intended her to have, the knowledge to stand alone. As Paisley pressed her palms against the quilt, she knew those lessons were about to become her only defense, because the account she had once called family had just declared her insolvent. Stanford was the first place Paisley felt both invisible and free at the same time. Invisible because no one there cared about the Harper family name. Free because for once she could define herself by numbers on a ledger rather than a role assigned at the dinner table. Eleanor's inheritance covered her first year's tuition and books. After that, Paisley pieced it together with scholarships, work study in the library, tutoring calculus on weekends. She grew accustomed to counting every dollar twice, not out of fear, but out of pride. Back home, Ethan had chosen UCLA. Her parents paid the bill in full, justifying the expense with words Paisley could still hear. "He needs the right environment to succeed." His right environment was an apartment near the beach and a new car in the driveway. Hers was a dorm with peeling paint, shifts at the dining hall, and textbooks bought used and resold for cash. After graduation, Paisley moved east to Denver, taking a position with a financial consulting firm. Her apartment in Capitol Hill was barely 700 square feet, but it was hers. Each piece of furniture she bought secondhand and refinished felt like a declaration. Paisley built her life brick by brick. Her emergency fund grew slowly, then steadily. Retirement contributions followed, and eventually a portfolio that outpaced even some of her older colleagues. But discipline did not erase obligation. Every month without fail, Paisley wired $500 back to Seattle. It had begun years earlier during what her father called a temporary slowdown in the construction business. Paisley told herself it was her contribution, proof she still belonged to the family unit despite the distance. Even after the company recovered, the transfers continued unquestioned. She thought of it as duty then, as though her independence had to be subsidized by a tether. Tonight, sitting in the guest room with her parents' voices still echoing through her, Paisley saw it differently. The money she had sent all those years was more than obligation. It was fuel for a machine that now claimed she was worth nothing at all. Thanksgiving dinner was meant to be a celebration, but in her family, it always felt more like a stage. The table glowed with crystal glasses and silver polished to perfection, every detail curated by her mother. Paisley had rehearsed how she would tell them how Daniel had asked her to marry him, how the ring was exactly what she wanted, simple and chosen with care. She waited for the right moment, but before she could finish the sentence, Ethan cleared his throat and launched into a description of his latest startup idea. Her father leaned forward immediately, eyes alight, peppering him with questions about market growth and venture capital. Her mother placed her hand over Ethan's and smiled proudly, as though the meal itself had been prepared in honor of his vision. When Paisley tried again, gently mentioning her engagement, the words fell flat. Margaret glanced at her briefly, her lips curling into that faint smile Paisley had come to know too well. It was the smile that told her Margaret heard her, and also that she had already decided the subject was unworthy of attention. The conversation shifted back to Ethan, and Paisley's news vanished like a dropped fork beneath the table. Hours later, while the house settled into its late-night quiet, Paisley walked past the study. The door stood ajar again. William's voice was firm, certain. The business, the house, the trust, all of it will go to Ethan. It's already structured. She doesn't need any of it. Paisley held her breath, her heart hammering against the wall of her chest. Through the narrow opening, she saw Ethan nod, uneasy but silent. Her mother stood at the window, her reflection caught in the glass. She turned, saw Paisley there, and met her eyes without surprise, then smiled, the same knowing smile that had silenced her at dinner before turning back, as though Paisley's exclusion had always been part of the plan. Paisley slipped back into the hallway, the echo of her mother's smile burning hotter than her father's words, already knowing she could not let the night end without opening every ledger they had tried to keep hidden. The house was dark except for the dim light in the guest room where Paisley sat with her laptop balanced on her knees. She should have been sleeping, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's smile, that quiet confirmation of her erasure. Instead of rest, she opened the folders she had carried across the country, the meticulous records she always kept. Bank transfers, account summaries, scanned receipts. At first, she told herself she was only reviewing them to distract her mind, but as the hours passed, the story of her life began to unfold in numbers that spoke louder than any holiday toast. Line after line showed the monthly transfers, $500 without. Fail, stretching back nearly 7 years, $42,000 wired faithfully to a family account she now knew had nothing to do with temporary slowdowns. She scrolled further and froze when she saw another entry. $8,000 pulled directly from the inheritance Eleanor had left her. The account had been drained 3 years earlier, disguised as a family investment. She traced it to Ethan's app launch, the one that fizzled before the ink was dry on his glossy business cards. No one had asked her. No one had repaid her. Then came the greater violation. She found loan documents linked to her father's construction company, the guarantor section bearing her name, her credit history, her stability leveraged without her knowledge. Paisley remembered signing a stack of insurance forms one Christmas visit, not realizing what had been slipped inside. The realization chilled her more than the November air seeping through the window. She began typing page after page. She cataloged not just the money, but the moments, the championships she attended alone, the scholarships she fought for, the dinners where Ethan's sketches or ideas eclipsed her every accomplishment. 7 pages in total, a record of a lifetime's imbalance. It wasn't for them. It was for her. Proof she hadn't imagined it. Evidence that could withstand the denials she knew were coming. By the time the first light pressed against the blinds, her hands ached from typing, but her mind was clear. She had tallied the ledger, and the balance was final. The only task left was to place it before them. By the time dawn lifted over the hills, Paisley had already brewed a full pot of coffee. The ritual steadied her, measured scoops, the hum of the machine, the sharp scent filling the quiet kitchen. She set 4 mugs on the dining table, one for each of them, and laid the folders beside them like place cards at a banquet no one had wanted. William was the first to appear, drawn by the smell. His eyes flicked from the mugs to Paisley's face, then to the neat stack of papers. He knew it was no ordinary breakfast. Without waiting for him to speak, Paisley gestured to his seat. "Sit down. There are things we need to discuss." Margaret entered moments later, still immaculate in her morning clothes, a faint trace of perfume trailing her. Ethan stumbled in last, hair mussed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. They took their places, puzzled but wary. Paisley slid a folder toward each of them. "Inside is a complete record of every dollar I've contributed to this family since leaving for Denver. $42,000 in transfers, $8,000 stolen from the inheritance Grandma Eleanor left me, and fraudulent loan documents signed in my name." "Read them." William flipped a page, his jaw tightening. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Business is complicated. Families help one another." "Help doesn't involve forgery," Paisley answered. Her voice was steady, calm, the tone she used in boardrooms. Margaret reached for her mug, fingers trembling slightly. "Paisley, darling, you're overreacting. We've always supported you in our way. Think of everything we've done. Your education, your opportunities. My education was paid for with scholarships and jobs. My opportunities, I carved myself. What you've done is siphon my resources while telling me I didn't matter." Ethan sat silent, staring at the papers, lips parted but no words coming. Paisley let the weight of the evidence press into the silence. Finally, she pushed her chair back and stood. "I'm done. No more transfers. No more guarantees. I will not underwrite this family while being erased from it." The room seemed to contract, the polished table suddenly too small to contain them. William's eyes narrowed, Margaret's face paled. Ethan's fingers tightened around the folder. Paisley left the words there, final, already preparing for what would come next. Ethan was the first to break the silence, his voice rough with disbelief. "Paisley, you've misunderstood. Dad never meant you weren't included. These things are complicated. You're making it sound worse than it is." Paisley met his eyes across the table. "Did I misunderstand working nights at the library while you were given a car at 16? Did I misunderstand paying my own way through Stanford while Mom and Dad covered every dollar of your tuition at UCLA? Did I misunderstand sending $500 a month from my salary while you lived rent-free in an apartment they furnished for you?" Color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed again, no words arriving quickly enough to blunt the truth. Paisley leaned forward. "The app launch you bragged about, the one that failed within months. Do you know where part of the funding came from?" His brows knit, uncertainty flickering. "Dad said $8,000, Paisley cut in, "from Grandma Eleanor's inheritance, money left to me for education. It went into your project without my knowledge and without a single word of repayment." The paper in his hands trembled as he scanned the lines of her documentation. For the first time, he looked less like the favored son and more like someone who had been kept in a carefully curated illusion. He turned to their parents, his voice rising. "Is this true? You took her money to cover my business. You've been using her transfers all these years." Margaret started to answer, smoothing her tone into reason, but William's sharp glance silenced her. The look only confirmed what Ethan already suspected. His shoulders sagged, confusion giving way to something closer to shame. For the first time, Paisley saw the strings that had kept him elevated, and she watched him realize they had been pulled by the same hands that had tied her down. The room felt different then, as if the script had slipped from their control, and Ethan was left staring at the pages, unsure whether to keep reading or to finally set them aside. After the confrontation, the house seemed to close in on Paisley. Every polished surface reflected back a version of herself she no longer recognized. She returned to the guest room and began to pack. The movements were efficient, practiced, like preparing for a business trip, though this time she knew she would not be coming back. On her laptop, she canceled every authorization connected to the family accounts. The automatic transfer stopped with a few clicks, and she sent notices to her bank that no future payments should be processed. Next came the harder work, placing freezes on her credit reports, locking down the identity her father had used so freely. Her firm's legal department responded within the hour to her encrypted message, confirming they would pursue the fraudulent guarantees tied to her name. With each step, the ties loosened until all that remained were the shadows of them. Her suitcase stood ready by the door before dawn. Paisley had already changed her flight to Boston, where a new senior role waited. It was more than a promotion. It was a chance to start over in a city where no one knew her as William and Margaret's daughter, where her work would stand without comparison. Before she left, Paisley reached into her bag for the one item she had carried quietly all these years, the brass key to Eleanor's craftsman house. It no longer opened any lock, but it had always reminded her of safety. She stopped at a small shop near the airport and asked them to engrave a single word across its worn surface: boundaries. When she boarded the plane, the key rested in her palm, warm from her grip, a final inheritance, not of money, but of meaning. As the wheels lifted from Seattle's runway, Paisley understood that her life was no longer collateral for anyone else's debts. Months passed before the first message arrived. Margaret's email dripped with sentiment, weaving childhood memories into pleas for understanding. She reminded Paisley of holidays past, of meals prepared and sacrifices supposedly made, though each line carried the unmistakable weight of guilt. Paisley read it twice, then answered with 3 sentences: acknowledgement of receipt, clarification that she was well, and a reminder that future correspondence should be limited to matters requiring documentation. William reached out soon after, though his tone was strictly professional. He introduced Paisley as a trusted consultant in letters to his business partners, as though attaching her name might salvage the credibility he had lost. She redirected each inquiry to her firm's general line, ensuring he received nothing more than the same automated courtesy extended to any other client. The distance was firm, and she held it. Ethan's call came later, hesitant at first. He didn't dress his words in excuses. Instead, he admitted what Paisley had long suspected, that he had leaned on their support without asking where it came from, that he had accepted the advantages as natural. "I thought I needed them," he said quietly, "but I think I just didn't know how to stand without the scaffolding." His voice carried no demand, only recognition. For the first time, Paisley believed he might learn to carry his own weight. In Boston, Paisley built something Eleanor would have recognized. She established a scholarship in her grandmother's name, dedicated to teaching young women in Colorado the very lessons Eleanor once laid across her kitchen table. Applications filled her inbox, students eager to understand budgeting, credit, independence. Each story reminded Paisley that her grandmother's legacy had never been the money, but the knowledge she gave freely. The past still pressed against her at times, but it no longer dictated her balance sheet. Paisley was investing in futures that saw worth where hers once had been denied, and preparing for the day she would finally hang Eleanor's key on her own wall. Her apartment in Boston overlooked the Charles River, the water shifting gold under the late afternoon sun. On the wall above her desk hung a simple frame, and inside it, the brass key Eleanor once pressed into her palm. The engraving glinted faintly in the light. Boundaries. It had become more than a relic. It was a compass, a reminder that the lock she chose mattered more than the doors closed to her. When Paisley and Daniel married, the ceremony was small, held in a hall lined with windows that opened onto the harbor. Friends stood with them, colleagues who knew her not as someone's daughter, but as someone whose work mattered. Ethan came alone, his suit ill-fitting, his expression subdued. He offered a quiet congratulations and no defense of the people who stayed away. That silence was its own kind of reckoning. The absence of William and Margaret did not hollow the day. Instead, it confirmed what Paisley had come to understand. But by those who invest in your worth without demanding repayment. Her grandmother had known that truth long before she did. Eleanor planted it in Paisley, and she carried it here to this city, to this life she built without their scaffolding. In the evenings, Paisley sometimes sat beneath the frame and let her eyes rest on the key. It no longer opened Eleanor's craftsman house, but it unlocked something far greater. It spoke of freedom earned, of dignity reclaimed, of love chosen rather than owed. And as she looked out over the river, Paisley knew that the future waiting beyond her door was one she would open on her own terms. Paisley sat by the Charles River, the brass key engraved with boundaries resting in her palm. The weight of her family's betrayal had taught her a truth Eleanor had always known. Worth is not owed, but earned. Her parents' dismissal and Ethan's unwitting privilege revealed how love could be weaponized, how loyalty could be exploited. Yet through Eleanor's lessons, Paisley learned to measure her value in resilience, not their approval. Financial independence became her shield. Each dollar saved a step toward freedom. The ledger she built was more than numbers. It was proof of her agency, a record of surviving neglect. She understood now that family isn't defined by blood, but by those who see you without demanding you diminish yourself. Boundaries, she realized, were not walls but choices, a way to protect her future from those who would claim it. As she looked across the water, Paisley vowed to invest in herself and others, like the young women her scholarship would uplift, knowing her worth was no longer subject to anyone's appraisal but her own. The key, like her life, was hers to hold, unlocked